So the last big macro variable we're going to talk about in this class is the price level and inflation. Price level is more of a conceptual idea that theoretically you could come up with some average price of all goods and services in the economy. And then the inflation is at what rate is that price level changing, okay? So when the price level is increasing from one year to the next, the percentage change is what you would be focusing on. At what rate is it changing? That's actually your inflation rate. If the price level is decreasing, we would call it deflation. And then there's one more thing that gets confused with deflation a lot, which is called disinflation. And that's simply that the price level is increasing, but not as much as it used to. So if you have a series of price levels that are going up, and they're going up by 2% one year, that's inflation. 4% the next year, inflation. It goes up again next year, but it only goes up 1%. So it's an increase in the price level, but at a slower rate. They call it disinflation. To actually be deflation, you'd have to see it actually go negative. The percentage change calculation would actually be negative. To make it a little more confusing, we generally talk about the inflation rate as a generic name, and then you do the calculation to figure out if it's positive or negative. So we could ask, what is the inflation rate? Have you do the calculation. It comes out negative 3%. Then technically that's 3% deflation, or you could say negative 3% inflation. All right, so if I haven't totally lost you yet, let's see here. We want to focus on this idea, this price level. It's the average price of prices, I guess, or well, I guess it's the average price of all goods and services. How the heck do you go about doing that? And the truth is, the only way we could do it, we couldn't possibly actually add up and divide by whatever we would divide by to come up with an average. So we must have some other way to do it. And what we do is actually come up with an index value. And so I'll talk a little bit here about what an index value is in a minute. But the overall thing we're trying to do is we have this thing we're calling an index value. It'll be a CPI is a consumer price index, PPI is a producer price index. The GDP deflator that we learned was also an index calculation. All an index calculation is that somehow, depending what we're talking about, you have the value of something or another that you've measured in the, and I'm going to put CY for current year. You divide that, kind of get it as a percentage of the same measure, but measured in the, what I'm going to call base year, whatever year has been designated as a base year, and you do times 100. And from that, you have an index. And so what this allows us to do is to kind of come up with, and we'll talk about CPI in this video, a basket of goods that the consumers tend to buy. The government does surveys. They figure out what percentage of our budget tends to be spent on what type of good. They gather all the prices for these different categories. They weight them by how important they are in our budget. And they come up with some measure in that year. What would be the cost of this typical consumer basket in this year? And so that would be this top part here. And then they would compare it to the value of that same basket of goods for whatever year they've designated as the base year, okay? And so if the value in this year is higher than it used to be, this whole index will come out as greater than 1. And so it'll be times 100, so it'll be 101, it'll be 102, 110. So that hopefully gives you some idea of what I'm talking about in this next slide, as I actually give you a unrelated example of an index, because an index does not have to be price related. It can be used for anything. So let's look at an example. All right, so here's our basic formula for calculating the index. We're going to do traffic accidents. If there's maybe a small town that's calculating how many traffic accidents they have every year, and they want to know, is it increasing, is it decreasing, so they can make better policy decisions. And that's basically what you're doing with the price index. You just need to know what is happening with prices so you can kind of understand what's going on in the economy. All right, so with our traffic accidents, we're just going to go ahead and designate 2008 as the base year, the initial year that they've decided to compare all future years to. And we're going to say that there were 85 traffic accidents, okay? So what would the index be for 2008? Well, it wouldn't be that interesting because the current year value is 85, the base year value is 85 times 100. So your index value is 100, and it always will be for the base year. It's sort of by definition. Let's say 2009 that there were 90 accidents. What does that mean for the base year? So the current year is 90. The base year is 85 times 100. And if you get your calculator out and do that calculation, I show 105.9%. Okay. Let's talk for just a second what we can do with that. We can compare 105.9 to 100. We can see that it's 5.9 bigger. It's 5.9% bigger. So this is telling us that almost 6% increase in traffic accidents over that 1 year. So now let's go on to 2010, and they calculate, or count, I guess it should say, 95 accidents. So again, we do 95 as the current year this time, over 85 base year times 100, and now I get 111.8. All right, so we can also then say that there's been an 11.8% increase since the base year, but what we cannot say, how should I designate this? Cannot say 111.8 minus 105.9 actually is 5.9. We cannot say that there's been a 5.9% increase in accidents from 2010 to 2009. That would not be correct. Because what you actually do to calculate the percentage change from 1 year to the next is use the percentage change formula. And so when we were comparing to the 100, it was okay, we could get away with, I should say, just subtracting 5.9 from 100 and see that. But technically we were doing the percentage change formula, just didn't have to, we could do it in our heads, I guess is what I want to say. So the actual percentage change formula then is the value in the second period, 111.8, minus value in the first period as a percentage of value in the first period, and then always times 100, and that gives you a percentage calculation of 5.6%. So when we were talking about it using the 100, we would have 100 here, we'd have 100 here, and you can see that it's going to come out just as a simple calculation. But in truth, what you were doing when you made this comparison to the base year is this calculation. It's just like I said, you could do it in your head. So this is truly the correct way to always safely calculate the percentage change. Value in the second period minus value in the first period is a percent of the value in the first period times 100. So you are finding the change in the index from 1 year to the next. That's your numerator. And then you're just basically saying, is that a big change? Is that a small change? Let me compare it to what it originally was. That's what your percentage change formula does. And then we do times 100 just so we can have the percentage symbol on there. All right, so how does this relate to inflation and prices? Well, what we're doing with the CPI that we'll look at in just a sec is coming up with this sort of information, some sort of current year estimation of the average prices of goods and services. And then we can use that information to build an index. That's what we were doing over here, is building an index. And so these are the values, these 100, 105.9, 111.8. These are the index values, and these are the sorts of numbers we're talking about when we say, what is the CPI for this year? You know, you actually look at the index value, and then you use the index values to calculate the rate of change, and that's your inflation. All right, so here is one example of CPI that I found online that was publicly available for reprinting. And it's just showing us what they call the basket. So basically the government does a survey of consumers to try to figure out a typical budget breakdown for the consumers. Notice they don't have taxes in here. They kind of leave that out because the government doesn't want us to know how that's changing for us. But on other goods, this would be our disposable income. So after we've paid taxes, this is how our budget is broken down. So we can see housing is the largest component, transportation. So what is the significance of these weightings is they will track prices in all these different categories. And one category that we've had a lot of increases in prices in is this medical. And so you can find data that shows, you know, prices on medical spending have increased 10%, 20%, 15% over these last few years. And yet the CPI is showing as a whole measure a very low level of price change. And it's because we can see that it's weighted, that the spending on medical goods is weighted by 6%. So a big change in prices in something that is not a big part of our budget is going to have an overall small impact on our CPI. So that gives you some understanding of how the CPI works. CPI is an index of the cost through time of a market basket of goods. This is our market basket of goods that is determined to be purchased by a typical household. CPI does include the parts of consumption we saw in GDP, the part the consumer's buying as the final users, but it's not exactly analogous to GDP because we're also going to include in the CPI the purchases of used goods, the purchases of imports, because they're trying to capture the true buying experience for the consumer, okay? The CPI does not include goods and services purchased by anyone other than consumers, so the impact on changes in prices on what the producers are feeling, that's a different index. All right, so then basically at this point, all you would do is get the actual numbers that the CPI has collected for a particular year. So maybe 2005 is your base year, and then maybe 2006, they would do all this calculating, and that's supposed to be a 6. There we go. 2006, maybe they calculate that it's 102. 2007, maybe it's 103. And so that's all we're doing then. That's why I showed you that information on the indexes before, to give you an understanding that it's a lot of fun statistical enjoyment here for somebody to gather all this data and to come up with the actual indexes. And then that's your actual CPI. The inflation rate then is the percentage change, right? So these numbers don't tell me the inflation rate. The inflation rate would be, let's do 2006 to 2007, 103 minus 102 as a percent of its original value, and that works out to 0.98%, just a little bit less than 1%. So that is the CPI. That is how we use the CPI to come up with an average of the prices of goods and services, right? So the CPI is measuring the price level, and then we use that measure the price level to actually calculate the inflation rate.